Good evening and welcome everyone. Please take a seat and then we'll start the event in a few minutes, like 3 minutes.
All right, welcome everybody. I hope you're all comfortable in your seats. We would like to welcome you for the AAPI event for the book reading for How High We Go in the Dark by Professor Nagamatsu. And first of all, I would like to introduce both of us. My name is Aski. I am from Indonesia
And my name is Giorgio Freitas and I'm from Timor-Leste. And we all welcome you to the event for tonight for Professor Nagamatsu's book. We welcome you to one of our anticipated AAPI celebration event, the Asian Pacific Sci-Fi Book Fair and the Film Festival organized by St. Olaf's Asian Studies Department and Northfield Public Library Sci-Fi Book Club. But before we start, what exactly is AAPI and why is sci-fi? Asian American and Pacific Islander AAPI Heritage Month is an annual celebration that recognizes the historical and cultural contribution of individuals and groups of Asian and Pacific Islander descent in the United States. The umbrella term of AAPI includes cultures from the entire Asian continent, East, Southeast, South Asia, as well as Pacific Island of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. In 1978, Congress and President Jimmy Carter issued a proclamation for the 7-day period beginning on May 4, 1979 as Asian Pacific American Heritage Week. In 1990, Congress expanded the observance to a month. In 1992, Congress annually designated May as the Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. The month of May was chosen for two reasons: to commemorate the immigration of the first Japanese to the United States on May 7, 1843, and to mark the anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad on May 10, 1869. The majority of workers who laid the track were Chinese immigrants.
Now that we know what the AAPI is, what about sci-fi? Well, we would like to tell you that we're both part of a class called the Asian 130, which is titled Asian Science Fiction in Global Perspective from the Asian Studies Department. In this class, we discuss a lot of sci-fi works from different Asian and Asian American communities, like China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. We also explore a lot of concepts in this sci-fi class, such as the concepts of monsters, like famous one being Godzilla, if you know what I'm talking about. And then we have AI, the machines, aliens, time travel, and dystopian, and also superhumans. Sci-fi is not only important because it's one of our professor's dearest subject. Shout out to Professor Wang, who's been with us for this whole semester and helping to set up this event. But sci-fi stories is also a mirror for us to look in ourselves. Even though the story is rooted in a lot of Asian cultures, the message like racism, sexism, greed, and environmental destruction has a very universal truth in it. And besides tonight's book talk, our fellow classmates are also involved in the coordination of this series, both in on-campus events and also the off-campus one, such as the Asian Sci-Fi Book Fair that we all had last week, where we carefully select some collections of books and films and comics for all of your enjoyment. It will run for 2 weeks, I think until like 14th of May at the Rolvik Library, so I suggest that if you have time, please do check it out.
Not only that, Aski, last Saturday we had a cool performance and presentation at the Northfield Public Library. It was a huge success, and we hear that it was the second largest event ever hosted in the public library in Northfield, only the second to the annual Winter Walk. Watch out, everyone. The AAPI are here. And we would like to thank the Northfield Public Library staff who make this event happen, including Alexis Kraft, who is here with us tonight. Let's give a round of applause to him. Thank you. As for tonight, we have Professor Nagamatsu's book reading of How High We Go in the Dark. This evening, beside the two of us, we have a team of students who put the event together, including Annie, Annika, Denise, Ellie, Isaiah, Trevor, Teresa, Zoe, and let's again give a round of applause to all of them. We also have to thank our Academic Civic Engagement Director, Elisa Melby, for helping us this entire semester for collecting the books and the movie for our book festival. Let's give a round of applause to Elisa Melby as well.
Besides tonight, however, we will have a few film screenings for tomorrow and a few days after that. The first one, we will be having Everything Everywhere All at Once tomorrow at 7 p.m. here at the exact same place. And on Wednesday, we will have Paprika, which is an anime from Japan. And then on Thursday, we will have Train to Busan, the famous zombie movie that is critically acclaimed. So if any of those movie interest of you, please come at 7 p.m. on any of the days we would like you to have here, because we'll also have the discussion of each film after the screening. Now, to kickstart our St. Olaf and Northfield Public Library's first Asian AAPI Sci-Fi Book Fair and Film Festival, please welcome our Provost and Dean of College, Professor Marcy Sorter, to say a few words.
Good evening, everyone, and a special welcome to the members of the Northfield Public Library Sci-Fi Book Club. This is fabulous having you here, and what a fabulous set of events that we've got lined up for AAPI month. Our several events this year are the result of a collaboration. It's a new kind of collaboration for us between the Northfield Public Library and the St. Olaf College Asian Studies Department and Academic Civic Engagement Program. And in addition to all those wonderful thanks that already have been made, I just want to also thank Professor Ka Wang of Asian Studies for his role in lining all this up. Thank you very much, Ka. St. Olaf's connections with Asia and Asian culture go back to the 1930s, when the college began offering courses in East Asian history. And by the 1960s, we were offering courses in Chinese art history, Asian literature, Asian philosophy, international relations in East Asia, and the semester-long term in Asia. The Asian Studies program was launched in 1968, and by 1973, the college had begun offering Chinese language courses, followed by Japanese language study in 1988. This evening, we are fortunate to hear St. Olaf Professor of English Sequoia Nagamatsu read from his remarkable book, How High We Go in the Dark. In just a few minutes, we're going to hear from Steve Mouse of the Northfield Public Library, but I would like to first just touch on a few things about Professor Nagamatsu if you don't know him very well yet. Professor Nagamatsu began teaching at St. Olaf College in 2016. He's the author of 2 books, Where We Go When All We Were Is Gone, and How High We Go in the Dark. He has also published many short stories, essays, and nonfiction pieces. He serves as an editor for several journals and is the co-founder of Psychopomp magazine. He has received, among many honors and awards, a Mariner, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt Notable Listing, and he is a recipient of a silver medal from the Forward Reviews Indies Book of the Year Prize, Short Story Collection category, and also a finalist in its multicultural category. Professor Nagamatsu has been listed in the Best Books of the Year of 2016 by Entropy magazine and is a recipient of the Editor's Prize in Prose from Coppernickel. How High We Go in the Dark has been receiving a good deal of attention. It has been listed in the 2022 New York Times Editor's Choice Selection, Roxanne Gay Audacious Book Club Selection, and the 2022 Indie Next February Selection. And I'm now going to hand things over to Steve Moss.
That would have been a good introduction for you. I wanted to thank, my name is Steve Mouse. I loosely run the Northfield Public Library Science Fiction Book Club. I too wanted to thank some people here, the St. Olaf Asian Studies Department, Ka Wong and his Asian conversation class, thank you. Professor Zhou, Alyssa Melby, and Alexa Kreft, and the Northfield Public Library Sci-Fi Book Club. Give yourself a round of applause. I think there's probably 17 of us here tonight, so these digs are a little bit nicer than we're used to. So, what I really want to do is say thank you to St. Olaf, the students. Or how many of the students were at the library on Saturday? Are there any of you here that were at the library? We got one up here. Everybody give that person a round of applause. I've worked at the Northfield Public Library for 10 years, and one of my favorite parts of working at the library is when we have events, because it's usually quiet in the library, and to see hundreds of people, noise, and events, and people smiling and talking and sharing culture was just fantastic. So it was a really nice event. So that's about all I have to say. So thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you, Steve. It was a great pleasure for us to work with you and all of your members for our AAPI event this month. We would like to continue, and we would like to emphasize a little bit of Professor Sequoia Nagamatsu's academic biography. First, Professor Nagamatsu joined our St. Olaf English department in fall 2016. He grew up in Oahu, Hawaii, and San Francisco Bay Area. He received a Bachelor of Art degree in Anthropology from Grinnell College and Master of Fine Art degree in Creative Writing from Southern Illinois University. Professor Nagamatsu currently teaches first-year writing and creative writing courses with a specialty in fiction and literary publishing. Prior to St. Olaf, he taught at the College of Idaho and lived in the Boise.
Now, last one. To fire up tonight's book reading, I would like to share with you some rave reviews of the book itself. As said by the New York Times, the novel is a welcome addition to the growing trend of what we might call speculative epic genre-bending novels that use a wide aperture to tackle large issues like climate change while jumping between characters, timelines, and even narrative modes. It is a book of sorrow for the destruction we're bringing on ourselves, yet the novel reminds us there's still hope in human connections despite our sadness. While The Guardian said that Nagamatsu's skill lies in his evocative imagining of alternative realities and in how he builds bridges between them. How High We Go in the Dark is a truly genre-transcending work, in which a sense of wonder and literary acumen are given boundless opportunities to shine. While our very own Minnesota Star Tribune said, Nagamatsu's strange and sensitive epic is refreshing for its resistance to easy dystopian tropes and its commitment to the emotion of wonder and hope, even in the face of grief. Now, without further ado, let us all have a big applause to welcome our main speaker of this evening, Professor Sequoia Nagamatsu.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? So thank you again to Ka Wong and the Asian Studies Department and the Northfield Public Library. Can we get another round of applause for everybody that made this possible? When Ka gave me the option of the podium or sitting down, I had to take the sitting down and this lovely kind of coffee table here. I'm usually in bed by 9 p.m., so I was like, I would like to sit down for this one. So How High We Go in the Dark, for those of you that haven't read it, could be described as a pandemic novel. I started writing this over the course of about 10 years prior to COVID-19. And it doesn't feature the virus or the pandemic as the star feature of the narrative. What I effectively wanted to do was capture family, relationship, friendship reactions to the pandemic, spanning several generations. So how does the ripple of a traumatic event bleed through culture and community, our sense of identity? And how can we hope to become better versions of ourselves when we're plucked out of our own reality, for example, in lockdown during COVID-19? And how do we imagine what we'll do, who we'll be? How do we, step forward once we emerge? And in large part, this was the driving question of the book, and one that I had to wrestle with as I edited the final edits for How High We Go in the Dark while I was actually in lockdown. And I'm sure we'll kind of talk about this a little bit after my reading. How did editing and publishing a pandemic book during a pandemic, how did that influence the creation of this? In order to kind of give you a sense of what this is about, I'm going to jump around a little bit. We'll start off with the first chapter, the origin story of the virus that's called the Arctic Plague. And as I said, this spans generations. If we include space travel and relativity, then it also includes thousands of years. But we'll start off with the beginning here. So this first chapter is called 30,000 Years Beneath a Eulogy. And I guess before I begin here is each of these chapters did, or at least most of them began as a standalone short story in its very raw form. And they've changed dramatically in its revision to become what this book is. I'm kind of hearing my editor over my shoulder telling me to not call them stories and to call them chapters because we're marketing it as a novel. So here's chapter 1. In Siberia, the thawing ground was a ceiling on the verge of collapse, sodden with ice melt and the mammoth detritus of prehistory. The kilometer-long Batakaiga crater had been widening with temperature rise, like some god had unzipped the snow-topped marshlands, exposing woolly rhinos and other extinct beasts. Maxime, one of the biologists on staff, and a helicopter pilot, pointed to the copper gash in the earth where my daughter had fallen shortly before discovering the 30,000-year-old remains of a girl. We circled the research outposts, a network of red geodesic domes, peeking right below the tree line, before landing in a clearing. Maxime helped me out of the chopper, grabbed my bags and a sack of mail from the back. Everybody loved Clara, he said. Don't get weirded out if people don't talk about her, though. Most of us just keep that kind of stuff to ourselves. I'm here to help, I said. Right, of course, Maxime said. There is, of course, another matter. I half listened as I studied the land, breathed air that, like the fossils beneath us, seemed trapped in time. He explained that a quarantine had been put into effect while we were in flight. No one had expected me to come finish Clara's work, let alone so soon. Inside the outpost central dome looked and smelled like a dorm common room, with a big screen television, worn recliners, and a stockpile of mac and cheese boxes. The walls were covered with a mixture of topographical maps and movie posters, everything from Star Wars to Pretty Woman to Run, Lola, Run. Down the accordion-like halls, I could see unkempt people emerging from their bunks or labs. A woman in a purple windbreaker and running leggings sprinted across the room. "I'm Yulia. Welcome to the end of the world," she said, and disappeared into one of the 8 tunnels radiating out of the central domes, punctuated with bunks like the cells in a beehive. The team emerged from their workstations, slowly enveloping me with a musty scent of more than a dozen researchers. No offense to the scientists in the room. "Everybody, this is our guest of honor, Dr. Cliff Miyashiro from UCLA, Archaeology and Evolutionary Genetics," Maxime said. "He'll be helping us out with Clara's discovery. I know all of us lab rats will get even weirder now that we're not allowed to leave the site, but try to be nice." Maxime assured me that the quarantine was precautionary, since the team had successfully reanimated the viruses and bacteria in the melting permafrost. He said government officials watch too many movies, standard protocol. No one at the outpost seemed sick or concerned. Unwanted orientations into how Clara lived her life here soon followed, where she drank her coffee and gazed up at the aurora, the route she jogged with Yulia, the botanist, the tabletop lotus aromatherapy fountain she and Dave, the epidemiologist, used for their morning yoga sessions, the cubby where she kept her snow gear, which would become my snow gear since we're about the same size, and how for birthdays some of the team would make the trip to the nearest big city for karaoke to forget for a moment that the buildings around them were slowly sinking into ancient mud. "Can someone take me to the girl?" I asked. There was a notable pause. A researcher in the kitchen put away the plastic cups and bottle of whiskey. He was no doubt bringing it over to welcome me. The cluster of disheveled scientists, most of them in flannel or fleece, felt like a repeat of Clara's memorial a month ago. A church filled with her friends and coworkers, most of whom we'd never met before. I'd shaken their hands as they lined up to tell me and my wife, Mickey, how sorry they were. A man with spiky blue hair said he'd once tattooed a star system on Clara's back, a purple planet orbiting 3 red dwarfs, and called her a trip. Our old neighbors reminisced about how Clara used to babysit their twin girls, help them with gain confidence in math. A bald gentleman, her project supervisor at the International Fund for Planetary Survival, gave me his card and invited me to continue his daughter's work in Siberia. But after the crowd left, I held Mickey as we rewatched the slideshow I'd prepared, pausing on a photo of 3-year-old Clara at her foster facility. She held up the purple crystal pendant she'd had when we adopted her. We both swore we saw her eyes light up with tiny stars whenever she gazed into it. Outside the funeral home, our granddaughter Yumi played with her cousin, despite the heat rippling off the street. I could smell the smoke from the burning Marin headlands to the east, beginning to creep over the neighborhood. "Our daughter never seemed to need us," Mickey said, her voice barely above whisper. "But Yumi does." I clutched the business card in my pocket. At the research outpost, Maxime led me far away from the awkward stares of the crew to the mummified remains Clara had found before she died. "Annie's in the clean lab," Maxime said. "Annie?" I asked. Yulia loved the Eurythmics. Her parents are still living in the 80s. She named the body after Annie Lennox. The clean lab consisted of a plastic sheet, duct taped from floor to ceiling, separated one side of the bone lab from the other. He handed me a box of nitrile gloves and a respirator face mask. We don't have funding for anything else, but we try to be mindful of the pathogens we may bring back with us. Probably nothing to worry about 99% of the time, he added. "Right," I said, a little taken aback by his cowboy attitude. Some of our colleagues at Pleistocene Park, about 1,000 kilometers east, have made progress reintroducing bison and native flora to the land. More vegetation, more large animals roaming the steppes packs the topsoil, preserves the ice below the surface, helps us keep the past in the past. I doubled up my gloves, pulled on my mask, and stepped through a slit in the plastic. Annie rested on her side, fetal, on a metal table. So, a little bit of a spoiler with that first chapter is that, surprise, surprise, Annie, the 30,000-year-old mummified girl, also contains an ancient virus, and things happen. It eventually reaches the mainland of the United States, and the opening chapters follow the early trajectory of the Arctic plague. I'm going to skip a chapter that has to do with the euthanasia theme park because I don't want to go there right now. So we're going to go into an otherworldly territory, and so kind of thinking about sort of the sci-fi fantastical aspect of this novel. A lot of readers have come up to me at readings and at festivals and have asked me if it was an afterlife. And I didn't really have like a good answer for them because you could conceivably see this space as being a kind of afterlife. But it's also potentially something else because this plague has a very strange origin. So this is a chapter called Through the Garden of Memory. And in a lot of ways, this was the origin story of the title of the novel. And all of these people have been afflicted with the plague in some ways and are comatose. They're in a hospital, plague ward somewhere. I awake in the darkness. I can barely tell if my eyelids are open. I cry for help, for a nurse to turn on the lights, for any other patients beside me to make a sound, so I know I'm not alone. I'm no longer in a hospital gown, but in what feels like a t-shirt and jeans. There's no breathing tube in my nose, no drip in my vein muddling the pain. The charged air in my bare feet feels like how a child might imagine clouds, substantial enough to rest on, yet capable of being traversed, an infinite expanse and cocoon at once. Above, the air feels light on my fingertips, as if gravity has dissipated, but such physics would suggest a grounding force. I wave my hands beneath my feet and cannot detect where my body finds purchase in the dark. I start to wander, and soon other voices reach me. Where are you? I can't see you. My phone won't turn on. Mine too. Everyone, keep talking. Arms outstretched, bodies walking towards sound until we converge, chest against chest, heads bouncing off each other's like billiard balls. At first we count, and there are 10 of us. Most had been in the hospital plague ward, just like me. A few had still been living their lives. A lawyer from DC was getting ready for work, eating cereal with his daughter. An admitted felon had recently been released from jail for robbing his brother. A high school student and a VR game vlogger said he was diagnosed only days ago. He'd been playing in a game in his bed, hoping to finish while he could. An old woman had been talking on the phone to her daughter, who had just buried her children. My daughter had been coughing a lot lately, the old woman explains. She was almost shouting, even though I think she's standing a few feet away from me. I needed to believe it was just the flu. My parents were visiting me at the hospital, I say in perfect English, with no hint of my Japanese accent. I studied the sounds emanating from my mouth, a perfect California boy, lingering on the ends of my words as if every final syllable is made of syrup. The silences in our conversation fill my ears with a ringing tone, the sound of my own eardrums. I pinch myself to wake up. I want to see my parents watching over me. I close my eyes and open them again. I stamp my feet on the non-ground, hoping to break through whatever force or blanket of air is holding me. Maybe there's a way out of here, I say. But what if we're supposed to stay, someone says. I'm not just going to wait here, the lawyer says. What if we get separated, the old woman says. We hold on to each other, I answer. Who the hell put you in charge, the felon asks. He's the only one suggesting anything useful, says the lawyer. I can sense the shape of the others around me as we push through the dark like a conga line. The lawyer asks people for their theories, and it's not long until we connect the plague to this place. None of us can tell how long we have been gone. We aren't tired or hungry. There has to be an edge, a door or stairwell to somewhere else. If we cry out loud enough, someone will hear us. When the old woman begins to sing to fill the silence, we immediately join in, taking turns with our own selections. The Carpenters, followed by the Beatles and the Talking Heads. I'm in the middle of Kokomo when the lawyer matter-of-factly interrupts and confesses that he's been having an affair. TMI, the gamer kid says. Random much? I'm afraid of my wife will leave, the lawyer says. I have a family. Sure, a possibility, the old woman says. But if you're not honest with her, things will never be quite right. Are we just sharing shit now? Okay, my older brother was murdered in a hit and run, the gamer kid says. He was traveling with a bad crowd, you know. Not that I was a saint. Mom died of an overdose when I was a baby, the felon says. Not what you think. She was just taking sleeping pills to stay up because I wouldn't stop crying. My dad pretty much blamed me for her being gone. Been an asshole to me my entire life. I wait a long time to confess anything about myself. I never snuck out at night to smoke. I never had an affair. Never had a real girlfriend for that matter. My parents and I moved to America after my father's job ended with the shuttering of the Fukushima power plant. We helped my uncle in Berkeley with his bakery. I received scholarships for college. But I also remember long lines in drab government buildings, my mother crying at night. I rarely spoke in class because I was ashamed of how I sounded. I rarely spoke to anyone, and yet I wrote constantly. I was afraid I wouldn't make my parents proud, even though they told me they were whenever I showed them my stories and poetry. I'd spend hours locked in my room the summers I was home from college. My father would take out his reading glasses and flip through my pages with an electronic translator. Yes, good, very good, he'd say, passing the pages to my mother. He kept a notebook in his shirt pocket where he'd write the words and idioms that were unfamiliar to him. And he'd try to work this into his new vocabulary, into his conversation. Isn't dinner a ball? This picture you took has good chiaroscuro. Wicked tasty teriyaki. I'm stoked for your graduation. So talented, my mother would say. But when will you get paid? Soon, I would tell my parents. Art takes time. It's all about finding the right people who get your work. It's all very complicated. I think about my parents and uncle waiting for me at the bakery where I work part-time in the summer. Maybe they'll assume I'm wrapped up in my writing. I think about my family waiting for me at home, calling the police. I can see my father taking out his notebook from his top pocket, talking to detectives, telling them to break a leg. We hear new voices in the void as we push on, a cry for help, a drawn-out hello. We instruct the newcomers to follow our voices, over here now, until our bodies collide. I was driving the 28 bus, just pulled out of Fillmore, and suddenly all went black. Felt like I was falling, one newcomer says. Falling, several people murmur, like I was wearing a parachute. Anybody remember falling, I ask. Silence. My God, my passengers, the bus driver says. My bus. I consider the stories of the newcomers. What if we did come from above? And what does above mean in a place where we can touch the air beneath our feet? For all we know, we've been walking in circles. So what are you saying, the felon says. Maybe up is the only way out, I say. Or there is no way out, the gamer kid says, like an animal trap. Let's say there is a way out up there. How do we reach it? The lawyer asks. It's not like we have a ladder. More voices reverberate in the distance, too many to discern any kind of direction. The silence evolves into a steady hum like a crowded cafeteria, fragments of English, Spanish, German, Chinese, languages I can't make out. I tell everyone to count off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 63, 64, 65. What if? What if? I'll stop there for that one. And I'll read a short section from another chapter. This is, many years after the outbreak of the plague. And at this juncture, humanity is dealing with kind of two threats, both climate change and the Arctic plague. They're getting close to potentially curing the plague, but things are getting pretty bad in terms of the warming planet. And so they've launched a colony starship with the intention of potentially finding a new home for humanity if it does come to that. And so this is a short section from that chapter called A Gallery, a Century, a Cry, a Millennium. And the chapter follows a painter and a friend of hers on board. And they've been entrusted by the commander to paint murals on the very sterile steel bulkheads and walls of the ship. And the murals are of their memories, what they remember of Earth, the inconsequential people that we sort of, take for granted from day to day, whether that be somebody bagging your groceries at Trader Joe's, somebody that you have a stranger that you have a crush on in the street. And all of them appear on these walls as this kind of repository of what human life used to be. Okay. Stasis. Fusion rockets and antimatter boosters, cryogenic suspension, magnetosphere radiation shields, and artificial gravity. Maybe on Star Trek or Star Wars, I thought. But few could fully appreciate the Starship Yamato until they signed the government and Yamato Musk Corporation waivers and walked on board. Named after Brian Yamato, who solved the problem of harnessing Hawking radiation from microscopic black holes to fuel our main engine and helped us reach 10% of the speed of light. Oddly, Brian and his wife had elected to remain on Earth, even though Brian's teenage son joined the expedition under the supervision of the commander. They're working on a solar shade project to cool the planet. Trillions of basketball-sized satellites carrying reflective lenses the width of a human hair. End to end, the Starship Yamato would span 2 football fields and can accommodate a crew of 50 out of stasis at any one time. Reverse-engineered UFO technology, Area 51, the conspiracy theories from grocery store tabloids. Only a handful of the crew have the security clearance to know for certain whether those stories were actually true. But I like to believe we had otherworldly help, that someone or something gave Brian Yamato a push when he needed it, an equation, a schematic, an aha moment implanted into his brain. Maybe we're on our way to find them. The constant engine rumble like the ocean surf makes it easy to lose yourself in these kinds of thoughts. Once, as we worked on a mural, I saw Dory painting her son Fitch in a small landing craft on its way to a planet, covered with smiling green aliens waving at the sky. He would have lost his mind if he'd lived long enough to know about the Yamato, Dory said. The last image I have of him is on that coaster, his arms raised high above his head. Maybe he thought he could fly. Maybe he wanted to get a little closer to the stars. He wanted to do so much when he grew up. He sounds a lot like my Clara when she was little, I said. It's like a part of her belonged out here. Apart from our hours painting together, Dory and I rarely socialized. I'd see her in the mess hall, dining with some of the officers. She looked like she enjoyed their company. She laughed at their toilet humor, played poker with the crew. But between the jokes and royal flushes and gossip about who was doing who and in what utility closet, she wore a faraway gaze, as if she could see through the bulkheads. Once, when I saw her alone, I asked if she wanted to grab a coffee, and she told me she was praying. She was curled up next to one of the circular observation windows. From afar, she looked like a fish staring out from a bowl. Not like to God or anything like that, she explained, but maybe something that connects us. To wherever Fitch is, or your Clara. Lieutenant Johansson, the navigation officer, was telling me there's an invisible web that ties the stars and planets and galaxies together. We don't know what it is or how it really works, but it's out there, all around us. I've begun to pray too for the first time since I was a child. I don't know what Dory prays for, or if she asks for anything in particular. I think of Yumi dreaming for hundreds or thousands of years without a break, and wonder if she knows what's real, worry that after so long in her own mind, the reality of being with me in a new world won't be enough. I take long walks beyond the children's stasis chambers and the non-essential economy class lottery passengers, who will only be woken up once or twice during our journey. I tell myself that leaving was the right decision. When we arrived at the Centauri system, we received a decades-old message from Earth informing us that a cure for the plague had been discovered. The comatose woke up, and people began to rebuild their lives. Funerary corporations expanded to focus on climate projects, building seawalls around coastal cities, sponsoring the Solar Shade Project until the end of the century. The message bid us good luck and farewell. You always have a home here, it said. On this world or on your new home, we'll find each other again, one day. Personal letters arrived along with general messages to the crew, and for more than a week, the ship was abuzz with news and condolences and statistics from revived sports teams, a snapshot of life on Earth for the past 50 years. The ship's doctors organized daily sharing circles for those who wanted to celebrate or needed support or couldn't quite articulate how they were supposed to feel. I'm going to be an uncle. Can you believe that? Horace, poor kid. Leave it to my brother to give his son some old-fashioned bullshit name. I mean, I guess the kid is as old as I am now, older even. Maybe he even has kids of his own. My mother died a couple of years after we left. Not the plague. No, they cured that. But they couldn't cure the cancers that emerged after the virus, the lung damage. The letter was from my older sister. I imagine she's dead now too. She never wrote again. My folks moved to Ohio before the ocean claimed the tip of Florida in 2080. Apparently there's an underwater resort around Old South Beach. The Miami Dolphins moved to Little Rock. My brother attended the last home game before the city evacuated. The last official communique from NASA indicates that 3 more ships have been built. My sister was put in command of one, the USS Sagan, headed to other colony candidate systems. We're not alone out here. When it was my turn, I showed the crew the drawing of my family that my nieces had given me before launch. I told them about the letter they sent a year afterward, how a school paper they wrote about me ended up in the San Francisco Chronicle. Despite the knowledge that Earth has improved in our absence, I've always told myself that dreaming of home isn't helpful. No regrets. Somewhere out there near a star we've never seen is where we're really meant to be. Thank you very much. And I think now there's the kind of Q&A portion of the event.
Hello. Okay. Hi, everybody. So we are going to start the Q&A portion of the event. So if you have any questions in the audience, you can raise your hand, and then Ellie here will come by with a microphone. All right. Do we have any questions?
Thank you so much for being here tonight and reading and answering questions for us all. My question goes to, you'd mentioned that you'd been working on this for about 10 years, and then in 2020, pandemic hit. And I'm just wondering, as an author, how did you change when you looked at what you had already written pre-pandemic to how you analyzed and looked at, and how did it affect and change with your writing?
I mean, obviously, the content of the book, it hit me emotionally, I think very hard. So just being able to work on the book was sometimes very difficult. And that's, I guess, to give you a bit of timeline, I've been working on this off and on for about 10 years, and my agent called me in March 2020 and said that I think we're about ready to send this out to publishers. And at that point, she kind of gave me the options, like, should we wait to see if this blows over, or should we just, send it out now? And we didn't really know what this was or how long it was going to be, so we just decided to go forward, and we knew that, over the coming weeks, that decision was going to be met with a lot of obstacles. So we were very intentional and transparent about what this book was, that it was literary fiction, that it was focusing on community and people. It wasn't outbreak starring, Cuba Gooding Jr. or anything like that. It wasn't sensationalizing, the virus. So I wrote very heartfelt letters, very personal letters to, editors that we were sending to. So right off the bat, before the sale of the book, I had to think very strategically about what the place of this book might potentially be, once it was published. That it was going to be a pandemic book. No matter what my initial intention was, it was going to be part of pandemic literature. And so I was also looking very closely at the career of Emily St. John Mandel, who I had the pleasure of interviewing a few weeks ago, and the fact that people were reading Station 11 again, that the Station 11 adaptation on HBO was coming out, and how people were actually leaning in. I think everybody copes with trauma and events like COVID in different ways, but a lot of people were wanting literature and film and other media to reflect on what was going on, to serve as a kind of lens to articulate the experience. And kind of looking at what was going on with Station 11 and Mandel's dialogues with her audience, I took a long, hard look at how High We Go in the Dark was becoming. And I knew that I wanted to diminish anything that was too on the nose, just from coincidence. So before COVID-19 even had, come out, before I knew what that was, masking was already in the manuscript. Social distancing was already in the manuscript. People were dining in bubbles. And I took most of that out because it just seemed a little bit too close to what we were going through. I didn't want readers to relive COVID. I wanted them to experience the world of my book. And of course, people are going to draw parallels, no matter how I diminish things. But I wanted to make sure that there wasn't any there wasn't too much overlap where people were kind of just reliving the exact trauma, especially since the opening chapters of my book are quite, I think, emotionally difficult to get through. I think beyond that, other things that were going on in the early days of COVID-19 is we saw a lot of incidents of anti-Asian hate, violence on the street. And there were always, I think, Asian characters in my book, and it's something that I tried to be mindful of, not just as an Asian American writer, as a Japanese American writer. I want to sort of see characters in literature and film that look like me, that have my experience. But I think in looking at those instances of anti-Asian hate on the news, and even being mindful of myself, it's like, can I walk to Cub and feel safe, right? Like there was kind of that lingering thought in my head that like, how safe am I in a, overwhelmingly, white Minnesota suburb? That I wanted to make sure that the Asian Americans and the Japanese nationals in my book were expressing a very diverse, multifaceted experience of what Asian and Asian American means, that it's not this monolithic experience, that the families here, the friendships here, the scientists here, they're just trying to survive like anybody else, right? And I felt that was especially important to emphasize. So I changed a lot of characters that maybe, maybe weren't Asian to begin with, and or thinking about, what does this person's Asianness contribute to a particular chapter. The character of Dennis, for example, was initially not Asian American. And I felt like I wanted this character to really speak to my experience of being third generation Japanese American, and really coming to understand my own heritage really late in life, and not knowing a whole lot about my heritage until like my mid-20s. So I think Dennis even describes himself as being kind of a bad Asian, right, in the chapter. And I wanted that perspective there. I wanted him to speak to other Asian readers, Asian American readers, you know, who might feel like this is the first time, or maybe this is one of the few times where I've seen a character that's not speaking to the immigrant story or the rags to riches story, but grew up playing Nintendo and, you know, playing Pogs and watching Alf, or, you know, I grew up in the 80s, right? And that was his experience. You know, he felt American, but there was something else. Like, he knew he was different. He knew that there was some other part of him that he had just yet to discover. Or can we get the microphone over here? Yeah.
It seems like this book was very like realistic, at least like when I was reading through it. I was like, okay, like these all seem very plausible. So I'm just wondering like how much research went into the book and what that process was like, because you have a lot of different stories. So I feel like you would have to be very methodical about the way you went through it. So
yeah, so you know, I think because you know, a lot of this was written over years. Like the research was very, I think, scaffolded. In the last, I would say, kind of like 3 or 4 years of the book's life before it was sold, you know, I had to kind of sort of consider the timeline of the book. So I was like writing chapters. I was like, okay, like this aspect of the plague hadn't actually been written yet. So, for example, the first chapter was one of the last chapters I wrote. You know, because I was actually like so interested in how the pandemic was affecting all of these people that I was like, oh, I didn't realize that I actually didn't introduce the virus. Like, I need that origin story. So that came. But I guess kind of speaking to that first chapter, there was a lot of research on Arctic bases. So I read a lot of, you know, articles and scholarly essays and watched a lot of documentaries about kind of just like life on McMurdo, you know, and life on Arctic ships. And, you know, read a lot of, I mean, I teach, you know, in NCON, you know, environmentalism and environmental activism is something that's always been very, you know, near and dear to my heart. So to some degree, the research was kind of already floating in my head. So I was just kind of revisiting those books in terms of thinking about the climate science and chapters like that. When it came to more speculative chapters, like A Gallery a Century, which goes off into space, I had to really watch myself because, like, as a lifelong Star Trek nerd, I could really go down the rabbit hole and just do way more research than what was required, which ended up happening. And so, like, again, this was during the pandemic. I was in lockdown revising a lot of these chapters. And part of what I was doing to keep myself sane was that I bought an Oculus headset. And so part of my research was actually floating around in space and well, I need to learn a little bit more about red dwarf stars and these different star systems. So why not do that in an immersive environment, right? And I guess kind of beyond all of this, beyond research, beyond internet research, book research, taking advantage of my, you know, seeing Olaf email to like get into JSTOR, you know, I emailed friends. I think that's one of the few, I probably wouldn't have done that were it not for lockdown. But I think we're all, you know, like lonely. We're all kind of reevaluating relationships and friendships. It's like, I haven't talked to this person from college, from Grinnell, in like 10 years or more, right? And so I reached out to a lot of people, a lot of very, you know, smarty pants friends of mine who are actually experts in these fields. And like I have a friend that, you know, all he does is you know, study stars and star formation. And so I was like, asked him, I was like, well, you know, if I was on this like alien planet, like what would the foliage, like what would it look like if it had this kind of star? And so he was able to kind of answer sort of like these sort of like wild questions for me, that, you know, I was able to kind of like string along these facts. It might be a line or two, but I think that's what makes novel writing or just like writing fiction beautiful, is that sometimes going down that rabbit hole that might be like a week's worth of research might just result in like 2 sentences. But in total, 2 sentences here, 3 sentences there, it creates this tapestry of believability for the reader.
We'll go in the back.
Question on style. You wrote that all in first person. I assume there was a reason for it.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah.
How do you just first person for all these different
Yeah. So yeah, I think all of them are first person except for Melancholy Nights, which is third, and Before You Melt into the Sea is second, which I kind of just sort of consider veiled first. But I think for the most part, I did experiment with other POVs as I was putting together kind of the final, quote unquote, final version of the novel. But I ultimately wanted to keep the first person because for me, it really emphasized this idea that this isn't about the world so much. It's not about the CDC racing against the clock to cure something, right? It's not about governments. That's part of it for sure. It's all burning in the background and we kind of see that trajectory along the way. But I wanted the focus to be on the individual experience and individual relationships. And so I felt that, you know, embracing third person, I think the temptation as a writer, for me, I would have started world building in ways that I think wouldn't have been true to the project that I wanted this to be.
I think in the front middle here.
So you said these chapters, some of them at least, started out as short stories. Were there any that you had initially put in there or ones that you really wanted to get in there that ultimately it just didn't make sense? And like, what were your favorites that didn't make it?
Yeah, there were several that didn't make the cut. And I think this is true for, you know, whether it be a novel and stories or, you know, a novel cycle, whatever you want to kind of call this type of book, or just a more traditional short story collection that, you know, a bunch of stories does not necessarily make a book, right? There needs to be some kind of cohesiveness to that, even if it's just thematic. There was a story called Flay that centered around the character in Before You Melt into the Sea. And for those of you who haven't read the book, this character in Before You Melt into the Sea she knows that she's dying. And so she approaches a very unusual company that specializes in liquefying human remains and then freezing them into ice sculptures. And so she wants her remains to be frozen into a schooner, into a boat that will be set off into the Arctic Sea and will slowly, you know, become part of the ocean. These sort of like non-traditional ways of you know, disposing of our bodies actually exist, and was one of the rabbit holes I went down. It's kind of like very sort of like weird, strange, and kind of quirky ways of you know, of dealing with the human body, oftentimes in sort of environmentally friendly ways. So this character in this chapter that I needed to delete focused on her childhood and her adolescence. It focused on her friendship that she had that was rooted in tattoos. And so she was covered in tattoos. And this is nodded a little bit in Before You Melt into the Sea that she had preserved her tattoos, her skin under glass, and she had FedExed them to her loved ones. But this chapter actually kind of got at the root of the stories that those tattoos had told, like what each tattoo meant. But when it came down to putting the book together, I realized that the chapter needed to go, unfortunately, because there wasn't really any place for it to fit in terms of the timeline that I had created for myself. This was a story that was looking back to the past. And by the time that I was constructing all of these different disparate pieces, I needed to look forward towards the future. And so it would have been somewhat awkward to kind of strong arm in this chapter into the novel at that later stage. So,
All right. I think I saw your hand in the back.
Getting your steps in. Thank you for being here. You said that the first couple of chapters were kind of emotionally charged. It could be difficult to get through. Artistically, was there a reason you did that? Started the book that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first chapter, I think, is I think certainly somber. You know, we kind of get this grieving father that's you know, continuing the work of his daughter. And so we do need the origin of this plague. I think for me, that first chapter, I wanted to, of course, introduce the frame of the novel, one of the frames of the novel, which is the plague. But I also wanted to introduce probably one of the more important families in the book, and we'll kind of see the relatives of this family kind of in other chapters. So it was doing a lot of setting up, and both in terms of character, in terms of background world, but also doing a lot of setup thematically in terms of focusing, introducing the reader to the fact that this narrative was focusing on family, that there was some sense of reaching out towards something, whether that be hope, whether that be you know, just trying to form relationships in a time where that kind of connection maybe is very difficult. The second chapter is I would say is gutting completely, and I think part of that is that I needed to recognize that this plague was far worse than anything that I hope would never happen in our world. It's you know, infinitely worse than what we experienced with COVID. And for me, I needed to, I think, continue this thread of relationships and family and a kernel of hope, but also I needed to establish how the world needed to reset, and just how much this event, this traumatic event, had forced humanity, society, to really reevaluate how they live, right? So the funerary corporations in this world, this is how bad things got. They became the banks, right? So what we now consider to be kind of cemeteries and morgues and you know, funeral services, they became so powerful that they became basically our financial lenders. They had their own form of cryptocurrencies. And so I need to kind of think about, well, what would have allowed for that kind of major you know, infrastructure kind of reset that would also allow my characters to you know, think about, well, this is gone, this is gone, this is gone, in terms of just, you know, what we think of normal life, and how they would kind of like come out of that in the future. So in later chapters, because of that harsh trauma in chapter 1 and chapter 2, we see society that has really kind of come together in ways that I hope might happen in our reality. I think it's very optimistic, but we see death as being this kind of communal act, this kind of communal activity where a funeral isn't just for families, but it's for the entire neighborhood. It's this celebration of life. And that's something that, you know, we see kind of evolving to become this sort of, you know, you're raised by a village of sorts.
So I was curious to know a couple of different things, but so how did you come upon the quality of the virus itself? What inspired that kind of starfish-like regeneration, repurposing stem cell sort of?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So like you kind of so again, for those of you who haven't read it, like you're nodding at the very otherworldly, right, kind of speculative nature of the virus, where your organs are effectively shape-shifting, right? So like your heart might be slowly turning into a liver, right? Or your brain might be slowly turning into a lung. So the seed of that actually stems from the last chapter. And that last chapter was kind of the other big frame of the book that was part of a novel that I had written in grad school that I decided for various reasons to abandon. I was like, I got it out of my system, I wrote the book. I don't think I need to move forward with this. It was kind of one of the many books that writers write to just, to get better, right? But I was always in love with the idea. And I didn't fully want to abandon it. And when I started thinking about, what other ways I could create this frame for how we go in the dark, after I decided that it was going to be a novel in stories, I revisited the vault on my computer, kind of dug up the old manuscript, and I was like, I kind of like this sort of otherworldly, sort of like alien civilization. It's still very kind of rooted in kind of, the themes that how we go in the dark is exploring. And of course, this alien civilization, they were kind of, they're made of pure possibility. Like possibility is a substance in this planet. And so I decided to kind of run with that. And that was kind of the root of the virus.
Just a question. So you mentioned it a little bit, but one of the interesting things about the book is so many of the characters have intergenerational issues, parents and children not seeing eye to eye. Is that something that, as I'm reading the book, I'm wondering, is that something with how different age groups deal with different crises in different ways? Or is it an immigration, new culture type thing? So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I mean, I think a little bit of both of those things. I definitely wanted to touch on how kind of, the traumas and experiences of past generations evolve into younger generations. Some of the chapters are specifically dealing with that kind of intergenerational differences in terms of seeing the world. All kind of informed by this plague that might have happened, a year ago, or in later chapters, 80 years ago. But I think there's also just something that if my story collection, Where We Go, also similarly dealt with this issue of familial estrangement and disconnection and inability to love and all these sorts of kind of like families in crisis, relationships in crisis. My next novel that's under contract is also similarly dealing with these issues. So it's definitely something that is, I guess, kind of like a writerly obsession. Where that comes from, it's probably just my own life partly. It just is in articulating my own experiences with my own family and it's kind of relationships I've had, friendships I've had. And so, writing is a way of kind of, I think in looking back at my life, I find certain things interesting about those things, or maybe I'm having trouble even internalizing what happened with a friendship or a family relationship. And so it's a way for me to kind of figure those things out in a kind of creative format. And I guess on more of a craft level, I tell my students that I'm sometimes very suspicious of happy people. That I often like to be very cruel to my characters, because, I love them, but I also, if I gave them the perfect life, if they had a, wonderful house and all the money in the world and friends and family that love them, it's like, well, where do you go? So I try to put them in a place where they can learn about themselves, and that's usually in a difficult situation.
So, as you said, this came out of a number of stories. So, the through lines between the characters, how did you develop that? And if they were, how did you keep that track of that for yourself?
Yeah.
Was it conscious or did it just happen?
I think initially it sort of sprang organically. I started to realize that there were characters I was just interested in, the Yamato family. Once I created them, I wanted to see more of them. You know, like Cliff Miyashiro, and basically like he left his wife behind and his granddaughter. So it's like, well, what happened? Like, that's a huge trauma. Like a plague's going on. This woman lost her daughter, then lost her husband, and is now raising her granddaughter by herself. So I needed to revisit that, which is why I put her on a spaceship, and and she became the painter. So some of it was very conscious. I knew kind of like what connections were going to happen. But as far as kind of the overall tapestry and network of how these characters were connected and where they were connected, you know, I had kind of like a sort of a Criminal Minds, you know, bulletin board in my home office. You know, so like I had all the index cards and yarn and string and Post-it notes. So it looked like I was trying to solve a murder of some sort. And that was, you know, like, I stared at it and I was like, I don't know, this doesn't make sense. Where did this character go? You know, and it was like that for months. It was just kind of, you know, shifting things around. I would talk to my agent, talk to my editor. You know, we'd kind of like play around with different permutations until I landed on something that worked for me and worked for my editor. But yeah, I would say it was kind of a mix of like first kind of that organic of like which characters do I want to revisit, and then what's the order that makes sense, and are there missing pieces that I still need to write. There's actually some readers I saw, they posted on Instagram, made a constellation star chart of all the connections between the chapters, and it was, you know, really, really, really intricate and wonderful. You have to like zoom in. Every star in the constellation was a chapter. So, yeah.
We have one down here in the front.
Hello, and thank you for taking the time with us. My question is really, I think, intended to be a difference between reader and writer kind of question, because my reaction to many of the characters was feeling affronted. The various, as you put it, broken relationships, the doctor who refused to see his son, Dennis refusing his mother, these various refusals, shutdowns that resulted in what seemed to me to be almost inhuman callousness or even inhumane consequences, did get me thinking about when I thought people were acting human or humanly. So since character is such a focus of this, what is the human element, the human experience you're looking for when it seems so different from what came out?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, this kind of, I think, goes back to kind of, I think another answer I gave is like, you know, I want to put characters in like a difficult situation, you know, on a craft level. I also ultimately kind of want this to be, you know, regardless of the subject matter, like ultimately hopeful, you know, that like that slowly evolves. It's hard to see that, you know, probably in early chapters. I think, you know, I liked, in early chapters, I wanted to kind of get my characters to a place where change could happen at some point. That might not have happened in the chapter itself, but they're kind of on the road to acknowledging maybe some fault in themselves, right? Or acknowledging a connection that they had. I think Dennis in the Elegy Hotel chapter is kind of a good example of this. Like he's a flawed character. He knows that he's flawed. He knows that he's kind of a jerk and has been to his family, right? And that he's kind of hiding out in this elegy, like mortuary hotel, and hasn't made the right decision in time, or probably the right decision to help his mother and to help his family. And unfortunately for him, he doesn't, you know, by the time that he allows his character to grow, or by the time that he allows himself to reflect, his mother has already died. And so that's something that's going to haunt him later on. We see him, I think, grow a little bit later on in a later chapter, but at that point, you know, he was kind of on the right road for like a glimmer of a second where he was going to call his family and say, like, I want to do the right thing. Just unfortunately for him, the timeline didn't work out. And I think I kind of wanted to do some version of that in every chapter of, placing my characters in obviously a difficult situation, but they're coming to a point where change could happen, even if it realistically couldn't happen right then for them. So the robot dog, bringing father and son together, they still have issues. Like, they're still grieving for their mother. This robot dog that has contained the mother's voice, that's, singing lullabies that the mother sang, it was a vehicle for them to actually speak to each other. And when they're at her grave, they're at a place of stasis, at least. Not a place of healing quite yet, but they've actually approached a place of stasis where that healing could occur at some point in the future. And so I kind of saw that every chapter was maybe trying to place characters a little bit closer to this point where it's not just stasis, it's not just reflection, but I think by the time that Grave Friends happens, the characters are a little bit more capable of catharsis and change, even though they weren't capable of that in earlier chapters. So.
One in the back there.
You mentioned Gray Friends. First of all, thank you. This book was incredibly emotional a ride for me, so especially coming out of the pandemic. Those first chapters were, I had to put it down for a while. So, but great, just amazing. With Gray Friends, there's the community urn, which I thought was a really beautiful story and the beautiful idea. What were some of the maybe rituals or things that you were trying to work in that perhaps you, again, might have ended up on the editing floor, or was there something else that that didn't make it in that you really left? Or what's the weirdest thing that you read about?
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, like, I mean, I did a lot of research in Japan. Like I went to a funerary expo, so I was just like meeting a bunch of senior citizens, like at like funeral vendors, and like my Japanese isn't great, so like I was kind of just this strange like Asian American like wandering around a funeral expo in Tokyo, but like I learned a lot, and there are a lot of companies doing really wonderful and kind of weird things. Like, I mean, I've seen a couple TED Talks that have kind of explored this, where you might place your body in like a seed shell that you become a tree. But I think one of my favorite companies that I saw that didn't quite make it in, and I love this as a writer, is that you would have an urn. You would actually, you would use your cremated ash, and they would be pressed into a box of pencils. And the box also served as a sharpener. So you're effectively, kind of, slowly kind of adding back the ash into kind of this box that's also the sharpener. And I told my wife, it's like, if I die before you, like this is what I want. And everybody that I like is going to get a pencil, and I think that maybe that's a little bit dark, but I would hope that my friends would use the pencil and produce work that that they feel good about, or journal, or if they're in academia, maybe they'll take that pencil to a committee meeting. Who knows?
Back in the front here.
So I also had a lot of emotions. I read this book more when it came out, and then I listened to it in preparation for this. And I don't know what this says about me, but as much as I teared up at a lot of different moments and laughed a lot and the whole gamut, I sobbed at the end of this Notorious P.I.G. chapter. like, really, I had to go find my husband and get comforted because it was really hard. So why did you do that to me with this pig
Right.
that can talk? It felt kind of silly to feel that way, but
yeah. I mean, there's not a lot of. I mean, there's not a lot of humor in the book, but like, I mean, I wanted to, you know, in a very painful way, kind of like do this as well. It was just like a lighter way of looking at kind of a darker subject, but I also was very curious about exploring kind of the themes in non-human ways. You know, so we're obviously kind of getting kind of a diverse array of characters and jobs. We have kind of this otherworldly alien element, but what about our relationship with animals? And in thinking about vaccines and cures and just the pharmaceutical industry, like my mind immediately went to like, well, how do animals kind of factor into this? And when I read an article that doctors were trying to actually do this, and actually in the last few months, they've done it. There have been transplants. I think one was not successful, and I think the other one is to be decided. That this was, you know, something that is probably increasingly perhaps going to happen. That this is not fantasy technology. It's and that's, I think a lot of the seeds of my ideas kind of come from like, well, what could be, you know, what's based on kind of like what's going on now, what's likely in the next, you know, 10, 20, 30 years. Even something like, you know, the Starship drive in the Yamato, like granted, like, you know, they got a little alien help, but, you know, part of what runs their engines is also what runs the engines in Romulan warbirds in Star Trek. And the idea of harnessing kind of like radiation from like microscopic black holes like might sound far-fetched, but you know, it's a thing. It exists kind of in the canon of sci-fi at this point. So I sort of decided to kind of, you know, whenever I read something, I kind of lock it away as like, well, how can this tell a human story, even if it's something that's, you know, seemingly humorous or silly or, you know, unbelievable in our current life right now. So sorry for making you cry. Yeah.
Okay, I think we just are about to wrap up. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Nagamatsu for speaking today. And also, yeah, round of applause. And I would also like to thank everyone that came out today. Just a reminder that this is only the first part of our little film festival book fair that we got going on. Tomorrow we are showing Everything Everywhere All at Once here, so if you're interested to see that, make sure to come back. And then the two other movies that I can't really remember. It's on, just look at this if you're interested.
Paprika tomorrow and Train to Busan.
Not tomorrow. Everything Everywhere All at Once tomorrow.
Oh, yes, sorry. Wednesday, Paprika. Thursday, Train to Busan.
Yes. And we also have some light refreshments outside in the hallway if you are interested. So thank you all for showing up.